Even the boring sections, of which there are some, they both are very effective at conveying that and sort of make the sublime moments even better when you get to them.
It's kind of the Middlemarch for anxious men who think their girlfriends are lesbians.
Solomon and Smith.
Welcome to Solomon and Smith. I'm Milo Garner, and that is Jack Truckenpetter. While neither of us are Solomon or Smith, together we are Solomon and Smith. Today we'll be talking to Adam Walters on his favourite fiction in the past 200 years. That's 1800 to 2000, one a decade. And we say favourite intentionally. These aren't the best, but the personal favourites. However, I think some of you are probably already grousing with this video because the title is Books That You Have Never Read. And soon you're going to be hearing titles by Dostoevsky and Dickens and Balzac, thinking, I've read all of these. Who do you think I am? Some kind of illiterate? And you've got me there. The title is slightly misleading. However, give me a chance. I'd wager that about half the books on this list, half of the 20, are rather unusual. It is very unlikely that any of you have read all of these books. Indeed, there are probably a couple you haven't even heard of. If you have, in fact, read all of these books, if that's you, then I invite you to go into the comments section and just slag me off. Really, just take it out on me in quite a personal and hurtful way. Adam, that's your cue. And please, we encourage you, if you have a list of your own, to let us know, to come on the show and share it. Doesn't have to be fiction, doesn't have to be over this 200-year span. You could do the best paintings in every month of 1797. You could do the best books released in every year of the 90s. Anything, any crazy niche you want to fill, let us know. We'll make it happen. Otherwise, just stick the list in the comments below. We'll read it, we'll reply, we'll give it some insightful and beautiful comment. Other than that, here is Adam and his very interesting, completely unique list of favourite fiction.
Adam, you're an interesting guy. Your list is kind of heterodox. Where did you get all these books into your brain? Are you a Russian speaker? What's going on?
I don't speak Russian, but I can read it like not fluently, but fairly well. Yeah, I don't know really. I mean, I was trying a little bit to not go with the super obvious stuff. Not because that stuff's not great, just because, no one needs to hear me talk about it, basically. There are a few like more obvious choices, but yeah, a lot of them are quite, relatively niche. It was quite interesting. I didn't really think about this as I was putting it together, but looking back, there are quite a lot of connections and similarities between them in a way that, yeah, could be interesting to go through.
Yeah, and what's your background? What part is reading played in your life? What are you interested
Yeah,
in?
I mean, I did English at uni. I mean, both my parents are big readers, so I read a fair bit as a kid, then sort of lost touch with it really when I was probably early mid-teens. I got back into it sort of mid-teens, sort of indirectly actually. I was I got very into film when I was in my teens and international film, sort of art house stuff. And then sort of through that, you can encounter, other literature you wouldn't have encountered otherwise. You see Bergman talk about Strindberg or whatever. You see Wells about Kafka, etc. Yeah, so that was my main entry point. And then from there, I just kept reading basically.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of constant in the world of the big reader who lost touch with it in the early teens. I don't know if it's specific to our particular generational field in that so many options open up in the early teens, and the kind of living in the attic reading all the time is slightly less appealing briefly for a few years, and
Yeah.
then at rediscovery when cortex more fully developed. But yeah, no, it's almost like a cliche at this point for all the big readers, with a few exceptions, to say read a lot as a kid, fell away from it for reasons unknown, and then came back with additional gusto to read every book written by mankind, as you have done successfully.
Yeah, of course. Um, yeah, it did also mean that when I first started reading seriously, I sort of got into modernist stuff first, really, and
Yeah, me
modernist romantic
too. We
stuff.
actually have a very similar background here with it was artsy films. It was seeing films like Persona or whatever at 13 and going, interesting things happening in high
Yeah.
culture. And yeah, and like to the Lighthouse, I think was the fourth novel I ever read. I just yeah, and immediately that was the interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think I remember To the Lighthouse and Portrait of the Artist I read like pretty close together, and that sort of definitely sparked something. Yeah, sort of, and then you can go in a lot of directions from there, because they obviously are both like writers who are very steeped in those traditions, so you can look at their influences and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, where
Mhm.
did you guys both find To the Lighthouse as, novel number four? I just wonder what was you found it under like a door, you're like, well, this door-bound book, or was it like a big list that existed at the time and everyone was going crazy for Wolf? What was how did you stumble upon that as the re-instigating action?
I don't remember specifically, except that, so I say my parents are both big readers. I think we had a copy in the house. And my dad is like a huge Joyce fan. So I started reading Joyce through him. And then, it's quite an obvious like direction to go from there if you're thinking about like contemporaries and so on.
Mhm. Yeah, a hot girl in my year was into Wolf, and I thought I must do what must be done. Yeah, and we had a copy in the house though. I don't know how that got there. Ask my mom. She doesn't read Wolf. She doesn't
We'll
like
get her
Wolf.
on the show.
I'll get her on the show to do her list. Yeah, liking the name as well. Like being as superficial as that. I just liked the name Virginia Woolf. It
Yeah.
had yeah.
It's also short, which helps when you're 15.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And this was like genuinely like a criteria with the first books I read. I love titles. I liked like The Grapes of Wrath, The Catcher in the Rye. Just I liked these like there was something about the quality of a title. To the Lighthouse.
Yeah, I think
Prepositional.
this is why Nietzsche is so popular. Nothing to do with the ideas, just like title after title of
Best titles
insane
of all
beauty.
time.
Every single
Yeah.
one, you just want to pick that thing up. Beyond good and evil. What?
Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist. Wow. These must be good. Yeah. Should we dive right in then with the beginning of the 19th century, the 18 aughts, the noughties?
Yeah, yeah. So my first choice for this is Elective Affinities, Oliver van Schaften, Goethe. For some of these, a plot synopsis might be quite difficult. This one is pretty straightforward. This aristocratic couple, Edward and Charlotte, living this sort of like reasonably happy but kind of dull, complacent, like married life, have that disrupted by the arrival of these two figures, a friend of Edward's and a ward of Charlotte's, and it sort of tracks how their relationships develop with, yeah, the central sort of a lot of sort of scientific metaphors taken from like the elective affinities, sort of chemistry idea. Um, and yeah, this feels like for me, like quite an appropriate like first novel of the 19th century to choose because it like feels like very much like a sort of hinge point between the sort of 18th century like age of sentiment type fiction and the sort of 19th century like simultaneously sort of more scientific minded and more sort of big R romantic because it's very much about like a sort of scientific or quasi-scientific treatment of like very strong
Of
emotions and
human
romantic feelings.
relations, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and like from that description, it might sound quite like a cold novel, but I don't think it is. Like it's not as like emotionally intense or like intimate maybe as like Young Werther, for example, or other sort of later romantic stuff. But it's very tender, I think, and yeah, by the end, like extremely moving in how it covers these characters.
Do you think
Mm.
it's critical of this chemical reading of love? Like there's a sort of irony, or is it interested in it? Is it actually thinking this is a way we can conceive of human relationships that, because obviously a certain sense of this new materialism or new science, and it's like, well, perhaps this is better than just figuring out what rocks can do. So is it a sort of like, oh, this is a new tool for human relationships, or is there a sense that you'd certainly get if it was a modern text? That there's a reductiveness being resisted.
I think sort of both. I think, yeah,
Hmm.
definitely. I don't think it's using it purely in a negative sense. I think there is definitely an interest in how human relationships can be sort of scientifically understood, but it's definitely not reductionist in how it depicts that. I mean, see, Goethe, was very interested in the natural sciences and wrote a lot about them, but clearly was not like a reductionist or like a reductive materialist in that sense. So, and that's sort of the tone that's carried through to this novel. It's like it's interested in that as a concept and as a metaphor, but it's not as sort of reductive about it. But it's also not particularly like clear. I mean, it's not a particularly like didactic novel at all. It's very there's a certain detachment to everything, how it depicts it, and everything it depicts.
Yeah, I'm moving on into the 1810s.
Yes, this again feels like quite a natural development because this is very much a like romantic book in every sense. The Golden Pots, E.T.A. Hoffmann, long short story novella. I'm not sure exactly how I'd class it, but yeah, this is one where plot synopsis is quite difficult because it's a student in Dresden runs afoul of like an apple seller who might also be a witch, and then starts working for an archivist who's also a wizard, who's also a salamander from Atlantis. And yeah, then things get weird.
Then they get weird.
Yeah, like we get that normal opening to lure you in, and then
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I love Hoffman in general. This is probably my favorite work by him. I think it's like the perfect like meeting point of the very sort of fragmentary short stories and the more extended like novels. And yeah, I mean, I I love German Romanticism in general, but I think one thing that's quite unique to Hoffman is the sort of sense of like the very physical and tangible and even like mundane elements that come into it. Like I love, Novalis or Hodlin or whatever, but they in a much more sort of ethereal plane, right? You don't get much sort of every day in their work. Whereas with Hoffman, it's sort of like these very often mundane elements sort of elevated to this like sublime sort of romantic level. Yeah, in a way I think is quite unique, at least for this period.
yeah,
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 what was the
they're
deal
very
with Hoffman?
grounded in their strangeness. Yeah, they're like and the Sandman, Milo's cat one. They're
Yeah.
really a world where things have gravity and where life goes on in its normal way, and but its normal way just happens to include salamanders and
Yes, yeah.
sentient cats and
I think it's less of a close similarity than with like Von Kleist, but does sort of remind me a bit of Kafka at times, like particularly like the castle, the sense you get in this of like just navigating this like bizarre, incomprehensible world where everything like could be a threat. Um, but sort of like unlike in Kafka, it's like the sort of divine, beauty and glory or whatever, like actually can be accessed. It's like if, you could actually reach the light in before the law or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I won't spoil it, but I think the ending to this is like one of the like most beautiful things I've ever read. Like it's just amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, and the
good.
humor, unlike Kafka, is very obvious and amusing. It's not sort of like you're reading something completely horrible and Kafka's cackling in the next room, like, buddy, this is disturbing. It's actually he's got a very sort of light sense of humor that you can tune into quite easily. But yeah, I
Yeah.
sort of I do wonder what was going on with that guy. I mean, have you heard any of his music? I'm going to keep plugging E.T.A. Hoffman's music in every single one
I
of these. It's
I
pretty
haven't.
cool.
I've read some of his music writings. Like I've read his essay on Beethoven or whatever, but I've not heard his music. I mean, yeah, he's feel like a very, very musical writer in every way. Like,
Yeah, and it's also just tapping into something kind of folksy, like a folk tale tradition. Like some, I feel like every Hoffman story is slightly being told to you by some sort of nurse, some elderly
yeah,
nurse from
I
the
mean,
village.
I was saying how weird and difficult to sum up the plot is, but that's not really different from like a lot of Grimm stories, right? Those are equally strange and equally take bizarre turns that you can never expect. Yeah,
Yeah, and the great thing with Hoffman is that he's inventing the folk tradition in a sense. Yeah, I mean, a lot of
yeah,
people were doing it at the same time. I had Frankenstein for my pick at this
yeah,
period. It's
yeah.
just it's a time for making modern myths.
Shall we move on to the barren decade? The decade for whom multiple people have struggled with this one. Multiple people have announced that in this 10-year span, nothing worthwhile was written and a sort of strange illiteracy plagued the world. Have you managed to crack it?
Napoleonic War PTSD or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think technically I have cheated a bit here because my choice is
Oh,
1820. So I guess it's technically the second decade. Yeah, I've gone with Melmoth the Wanderer, Charles Maturin, sort of Anglo-Irish clergyman and novelist. And yeah, this is very, very much like a Gothic novel, like the final Gothic novel, maybe. So just like very, very Gothic about this. So sort of framing narrative in Dublin, this student, John Melmoth, sort of gradually learns of the existence of this ancestor of his who he sees, well, first in a portrait, then in a dream, then in reality, because as it turns out, this ancestor has made a sort of deal with the devil to extend his life for like centuries in exchange for his soul. But the
Mm.
time is about to run out, so he needs to basically find someone who's willing to take on the deal and can release him from this. But that gives quite a misleading impression of what the novel is actually like because it's like very, very digressive. It's a lot of like stories in stories, like side plots, side characters, goes all over. Like, obviously starts in Ireland, goes to Spain, to India, to Yorkshire, I think. Supposedly, I don't know the details in much, but I think like it was basically like a contractual obligation thing. Maturin had to write a novel of a certain length to just fit in all this like extraneous stuff. But I think it works really well. I mean, it sort of has this like great sort of like globetrotting quality that's something I enjoy in literature this period. Like it reminds me a little bit of like Don Juan, Byron, and just a sense of like possibility and exploration. Melmoth, the character, has this sort of like very extended, very fun sort of like rants and monologues, which yeah, very very gothic, very like Shakespearean, sort of in some way quite similar to like Ahab in Moby Dick. And yeah, it's just throughout the prose is great. I mean, it's yeah, very sort of precise, sort of crystalline prose mixed with this sort of wild like structure.
maybe we should do an episode on the best artworks made cynically to fulfill some kind of abstract deadline or word count. Because it's like how the Godfather films, Coppola didn't care. It was a studio job. Oh, I can't make my
One for
film I really want to
them.
make. Yeah, exactly. And this kind of like, oh, you've got it has to be this number of words. Fine, I'll come up with something. Uh, only the greatest book you've ever written. And yeah, just the interesting thing of the artwork where the limitation is not only the limitation is not interesting, but somehow produces the really interesting work. It's not like I had to get around censorship to speak my heart, but that I wrote something that my heart wasn't in, or at least not initially. I don't necessarily believe that Coppola made the entirety of The Godfather dispassionately. Like, yeah, that take was all right. I guess let's move on, move on. But yeah, it's like a little interesting little subgenre of things that we like maybe more than the creators did. And you're always surprised to hear after finishing it or whatever that, oh right, this wasn't like a great brain bulging plan, but in fact, and do we get any of this? I haven't read this novel. Do we get any of it in it? Does it begin or seem at times to sort of it's treading water in the word count, or does it seem like one where Maturin is carried away and becomes enamored with the work?
I mean, it's yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think I was ever bored by it. I mean, it is pretty long. It's like 600 pages or so, but because it is quite episodic and quite, covers all these different areas, yeah, I think it does have momentum to it. Um, I think probably some people disagree. I remember seeing someone, it was like a positive review, but they were saying, yeah, I enjoyed this novel, but I don't think anyone has ever wished it was longer than it is.
What's your 1830s choice?
So this is Charterhouse of Parma, Stendhal, the other Stendhal novel, basically, with Red and the Black. And I mean, I love Red and the Black as well, but I think I slightly prefer Charterhouse of Parma. It's again quite similar, and it's a more focused plot, and it all basically follows this one character, this Italian nobleman, but it's sort of his sort of escapades basically across like early 19th century Europe against the Napoleonic Wars as a backdrop. Has a sort of quite famous sequence with the Battle of Waterloo, which apparently was an inspiration for Tolstoy for the war sequences in War and Peace. Yeah, as I said, I love both this and Red and the Black, but I think the difference, like Red and the Black for me feels like extremely 19th century in every way, whereas Charterhouse feels sort of simultaneous like 18th and 20th in the
Hmm.
sense of like the sort of very like picaresque plots with a lot of different episodes and so on is very 18th century. But the level of sort of interiority, I think, is not something you really get in 18th century fiction.
Hmm.
Um, and particularly like there's a sort of quite sudden shift that happens partway, like about halfway through, where from being extremely sort of expansive and broad in its depiction, it becomes like extremely claustrophobic and intimate. There's the whole sequence where Fabrice is sort of interned in a tower basically and can only communicate through letters, which I read during lockdown, which was fun. Um, and I think in that you see a lot of like, I mean, I think Proust specifically mentioned Charterhouse as an inspiration. I think like Henry James was a big fan of it, and you can see that also. Like Merzel, I think the shift that happens in that qualities where it becomes suddenly very, very intimate. I think that's something I think is sort of unprecedented, at least from the fiction I've read up to this point.
Yeah, and Stendhal himself said, I'm writing for people 100 years from now. And I also gather he wrote everything extremely quickly. Like Red and the
Yeah,
Black and Charterhouse were both like, didn't do any writing for years, wrote the whole thing in a month, didn't do any writing for years. One of those kind of.
yeah. I mean, I don't know the circumstances in much detail, but it doesn't feel like, Flaubert or whatever, everything is extremely finely worked over. It feels like a bit more, on the fly than that. The structure, at least, of Charterhouse is not, maybe there's a logic to it, but it doesn't feel super like tight, but I don't mind that. It sort of feels a lot more comparable to like Balzac than Flaubert.
Yeah, and quite funny as well. I
Yeah,
think
definitely.
just like the
Yes.
Waterloo sequence is just hilarious. There's a guy who's trying to be in the Battle of Waterloo, can't figure out where it is exactly. Um, can't figure out after the battle whether he's fought in the Battle of Waterloo. There was like there's just vague noises around, like in the Austerlitz section in War and Peace, where
Yeah, yeah.
Andre is riding around looking for, or indeed in that wonderful American novel, The Red Badge of Courage, Stephen Crane,
I've
which
not read it, but
it's like yeah, massive influence on Hemingway. But yeah, yeah, great artist, Stendhal. Kind of I feel underread, underappreciated in the Anglosphere.
yeah, definitely, definitely.
Over to the whatever's next. 40s, the
Uh,
1840s,
yeah,
revolutionary
so
decade.
yeah, I mean, quite a similar book in some ways, very similar sort of circumstances. It's Balzac, Lost Illusions, and I feel like Balzac, like there's like somewhat similar to like Ibsen. He's sort of a writer where the body of work as a whole, sort of has a significance that none of the individual works do. So they're all very interconnected. But
100%, yeah. Like
um,
Ozu in film or
yeah,
something. It's
yeah.
like
But I do think this is my favorite like single novel by him. And again, it's very familiar, like 19th century narrative, very similar to Red and the Black, about this ambitious, sort of ambitious protagonist from sort of humble background who goes to the city to try to, make his fortune, and things don't go well, basically. They go well for a bit and then not. What makes Balzac kind of unique for me is like I don't think there's any other novelist of this period, maybe except Dickens, I don't know, who just as like vividly conveys how much they enjoy writing. Like this sort of exuberance he gets in his work is like really, really unique. He just seems like completely, even when the novels like end tragically, which they often do, like there's such a sense of joy to the writing and the way he creates characters, the way he evokes like a city, a place, etc. Yeah, it's really, really unique, I think. Um, and sort of combined with this like sort of mystical tone, which is again quite unusual, I think, among novelists, European novelists of this period. Like a lot of them are working in quite sort of a realist mode, which he also sort of is, but also with this sort of like undercurrent of like, sort of mystic ecstasy.
To jump out a little bit from Lost Illusions, but just your feeling on the project novelists in general. We can talk about Balzac, or you could jump forward to Zola, but these guys with these enormously large bibliographies, all of which kind of intertangled, even in small ways, or indeed more significant ways, not necessarily the continuous narrative, but building out and out and out this collection of characters and personalities, which we get in sort of television shows now and like film series now. But I guess Balzac, I assume, was one of the first to make it this big and this expansive. I might be forgetting some earlier influences here. But yeah, how do you interact with that? Because it no longer becomes a sort of, oh, you read the single book. Once you've read the other one, it reflects back on the former book. Once you've read seven, all seven start talking to each other. Even, maybe the good ones are brought down a bit, the bad ones are brought up a bit. But yeah, just do you have any feeling about this approach to literature?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not aware of anyone who's doing it at this scale before Balzac. There may be, I don't know. But it definitely feels very unique. And it's yeah, because I feel basically all Balzac novels, apart from maybe the ones that are like explicitly sequels to other ones, can be read fine independently. Like you will understand it and follow it.
Mm.
That's fine. But I don't know how significant the intertextuality is. It definitely can be. I mean, so the ending um to Lost Illusions, I mean, I won't spoil it, but it has like a very direct connection to Peugeot, in a way that you can follow the ending without having read that, but it has an added significance if you have. Yeah, I can't remember which it is, but there's one where there's like just a very offhand reference to Louis Lambert, who has this like short story, like novella specifically about him, and it's just about, oh yeah, Louis Lambert died. It's like completely meaningless if you haven't read that one. But um, yeah, I mean, I guess it's not that different, I guess, to the way that something like Dickens creates a world within a novel, right? We have these different plot lines, different characters who are sort of independent but coexist or interact or whatever at times. But yeah, certainly the scale is different. Again, I don't know of anyone who did it prior to that in the same way.
And it feels like, as you were saying, this is just a man with such immense stores of energy, with like forcing all these coffee beans
Yeah,
directly into his veins so that he can write all night, every
yeah,
night for his entire adult life. Yeah, there's just a tremendous degree of energy in there that also compensates for sometimes the kind of claustrophobic cynicism and despair about human nature. I mean,
yeah,
there's only so many times you can hear like a nice idealistic character being corrupted by greed or
yeah.
sex or the corruptions of the city. Like, it's just, does this happen to just everyone in the world as soon as they step foot into Paris?
Yeah, no, and
Yes.
definitely this is among his most cynical, I would say, the ones I've read.
Yeah, no, and it's so tied to Lucian as well, and he's
Yeah,
such a well, an idealistic and a character with so many illusions at the start.
yes, yeah.
You really get to see him dragged through the mud, and it's a bit like Jesse at the end of Breaking Bad, ending up with the Nazis in the like
Yeah.
God, this guy fell a long
Uh,
way. Yeah,
It is also it's very funny in places, I think,
yeah,
because
yeah.
like there's a moment when one of Lucian's friends is telling him like, well, if you murdered someone, we could forgive that. If you become a journalist, no, that's the end.
I like that it's, as you were saying, most of the intertextuality is not that plot crucial. Just it's like, yeah, Rastignac is also at the party. Hey,
Yeah, yeah.
hey, I
Yes.
remember him. Hey, what's he up to now? Not much. Yeah, yeah. Let's get out of this godforsaken decade into the sweet 1850s.
Yeah,
Reaction.
well,
We're back, baby.
Napoleon the Third.
it is actually my third consecutive French one, which I didn't really plan. Gérard de Nerval, Sylvie. Again, very short sort of novella, short story, where sort of narrator is reflecting on his relationship to these three women, all of whom seem to like embody different aspects of his sort of ideal conception. Um, so in that sense, it's a very like, yeah, big R romantic like concept, like
So
that's
French.
very
Very
French, yeah.
French plot synopsis of all
Yeah,
time.
a man does nothing but thinks about three women, yeah. But also quite similar to like Novalis and like the blue flower idea, right? But also in a way that again feels like it sort of a bit like Stendhal, like it sort of anticipates later stuff. Like I mean, I think I discovered it as probably quite a lot of English people do through Proust, because Proust he writes about it in Contes sans Beuve, and I think I might be misremembering, but I think in the last volume of In Search of, he's like reflecting back on the Madeleine incident in the first volume, and he compares that to Sylvie by Nerval. Though Proust also weirdly said that there's like he says that like there may be too much intelligence in the story. I don't quite know what he meant by that, but
Dumb it down. Dumb it. They
yeah,
won't get it.
I don't get it.
but yeah, it's and also sort of as with Proust, there's like this sort of romantic like you know uh dreamy tone to it, but also like a real sort of precise and quite sort of merciless in places like dissection of how how people perceive the world and how people perceive others and sort of how they project onto others in a way that again feels very ahead of its time. And again, if you compare it to like Balzac or Stendhal, I mean, very similar context, obviously, but both of those are like these sort of ambitious characters trying to make their way in the world and trying to sort of navigate history and the developments of their time. This is a character who's completely cut off from everything. He does like very passive, very like removed from everything around him. Doesn't really seem to have much ambition. Um, in a way, it feels quite anticipatory of like the symbolist movement, like sort of particularly the poets who come out of that, like Mallarmé, Valery, etc. So yeah, it's a very interesting sort of hinge book.
Yeah, should
Yeah.
we shift on into the 1860s, a decade of no texture, slime-like? You sort of wash your hand over it and there it is. Wow. I think this is
Yeah,
how it's typically described.
well, that's sort of quite slime-like is quite appropriate for the book I've chosen, actually. It's not no longer French. It's a mutual friend, Dickens. My favorite Dickens.
Interesting Dickens hot take. Interesting Dickens
Yeah,
choice. Yeah.
I mean, it's probably his darkest novel, I would say. Maybe Bleak House, I don't know, but yeah, again, quite difficult to describe the plot just because it covers quite a lot of stuff, and it's maybe his most like complexly plotted. I don't know. Um, but it opens with the death of this sort of wealthy miser, and then traces like his inheritance, basically, what happens from there. Not a perfect novel, definitely. I mean, there's like, as often with Dickens, there's quite a lot of like sentimentality. There's some plot developments that don't seem fully worked out. I mean, sort of notorious,
No.
yeah, uh, sort of notoriously the figure of Boffin. It's not very convincing what happens, and it seems likely that Dickens like changed what he was planning to do with that midway through. Um, but yeah, there's a certain just like apocalypticism to it that I really like. Like it's so just yeah, unrelentingly, well not unrelentingly, but it's so grim when it's grim in a way that again I've said this about quite a few books, but it feels like very like it looks forward to later stuff. I mean, somewhat famously, Eliot's original title for The Wasteland was taken from My Mutual Friend. Um, very glad he changed it because The Wasteland is a much better title. But
Then he do the police in different
it,
voices.
yeah,
You don't like
yeah,
the title, he do the police in different voices. For the
yeah.
wasteland. He do the police in different voices. Line 1. April is the cruelest month.
Yeah, interesting. Would it have the same status it does now if it was called that? I don't know. Definitely like
The Nietzsche effect. You just
yeah, yeah.
titles, man. Titles. They're important. Yeah. What's the Lolita's original title was what? It was
Kingdom by the Sea or
no, a 50-year-old widowed male or something like that. The biography of a widowed male.
I mean the I do think it was probably an influence on The Wasteland. I mean the imagery of the Thames you get throughout the sort of like there's a lot of like baptismal imagery as well, which gives it a certain like sort of mythic quality that's not really very commonly there in Dickens, I don't think, or it's
Mm.
much less overt at least. Um, I also feel like probably like William Gaddis, like the
Yeah,
sort of pop
JR,
culture. Yeah,
100%. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. The sort of like just a world completely captured by money and like how the sort of intricacies of like legal relationships and how like money is not just like important to the narrative, but sort of like structurally important. Like the novel is sort of more determined by financial relationships than anything else, like how it's structured. Um,
Yeah, so it's a shame that we didn't have more 19th century English novelists who wrote the great cynical money novels. Like Trollope wrote How We
well,
Live
yeah,
Now, and
yeah,
and Dickens has this one. But I think like the English, they just understand money madness more than the French, who wrote a bajillion of these money novels. I mean, every
yeah,
Balzac novel is an extent also a money novel. Yeah.
Yeah, I
yeah.
think I think Gissing counts as one of our money guys, being the permanently poor
Yeah,
great
in the
novelist.
20th century, you get them coming like Orwell as
Yeah.
well. Every realist Orwell novel is just money.
You can get caught up in perfection. Maybe Our Mutual Friend is not the most perfect Dickens novel. I think it would probably be a rare choice for most perfect Dickens novel. But I think interesting to say that is true. Also, it's my favorite. And that the pursuit of perfection, kind of Renaissance Raphael style, okay, it is perfect, but is it the best painting? Probably, I mean, maybe not. in my view. And you just get it in these lists more, especially when we say you're not picking the best books, but your favorite books, because I don't know, it takes away that tendency to perfection, that tendency to think, well, what is the best constructed? What has the least dead weight? What is unflawed? Whereas I think what you're explaining, at least with our mutual friend, is it is sort of messy. It doesn't quite get out of itself, but in doing so, it develops a tone that is not common in Dickens, that is not common in its period, which could only have come out of something just being a little mismatched.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I mean, I guess if you're looking for like crystalline perfection, Dickens is maybe not the writer for you. I mean, maybe at times, I don't know, but he's not like Austen, where everything is so perfectly structured and written and so on. He's much more sprawling than that. But
Yeah, baggy and
yeah,
in a good way. And yeah, like it's great. Every Dickens novel feels like an unfinished version of a perfect novel. Like
yes,
the perfect novel is hiding in there somewhere. Like, and I suppose the version in Our Mutual Friend where we get a full-on mythic, ancient Celtic river gods novel written by Dickens. Like, God, I wish we had that. But you just gotta extract all the little hidden novels in there. Yeah, the 1870s now. This is a decade. This is a decade.
yeah. Well, I haven't gone with Middlemarch, even though obviously no one could argue with that as a
That
choice.
is the rule, to be fair. Do we allow this to go
I'm
on?
not sure. Okay, you have to officially pick Middlemarch and then proceed with a.
Well, yeah, this
You have to pick Middlemarch, and you're not allowed to pick Pale Fire. Those are the only two rules.
well, this is sort of in some ways a similar novel to Middlemarch, I guess. It's about sort of frustrated ambition in sort of small provincial town, but very different from that point on. It's Demons, Dostoevsky. It's interesting to discuss in relation to what we were saying previously because I think possibly my favorite Dostoevsky is The Idiot, but that's like famously a very flawed novel. This I don't know. I'd say probably his best. I don't know if it's my personal. I mean, it's probably not my personal favorite. It's also, I mean, almost certainly his darkest. It's very, very bleak, very grim. Um, yeah, covers this group of sort of political radical sort of nihilists who have this plan of sorts. It's not really clear what the plan is, but it involves some sort of upheaval and destruction. And yeah, it's a novel very much dominated by this figure of Stavrogin, who I think is like the most frightening character in Dostoevsky, which is interesting because he doesn't really do very much. He's like very passive in a lot of it, sort of quite similar to Mishkin in The Idiots. But whereas Mishkin is like a pretty obvious like Christ analog, Stavrogin, like you could read as the Antichrist. His name is like Stavros, Greek for horn, Rog, Russian for Stavros, Greek for cross, Rog, Russian for horn.
Hmm.
Sort of it's mentioned that he's been in Jerusalem and Egypt, so obviously it parallels to Jesus. And I think there is quite a long tradition of reading him as a sort of antichrist, a false messiah figure. But I think that's at least a bit too simplistic. Like, I think he's sort of over like burdened with so much symbolic weight. It's kind of very difficult to get a handle on him. I mean, he's also, I think he's mentioned that he's been to Wittenberg's association with like Faust and Hamlet.
Hmm.
He's compared in the novel to Prince Hal. There is at least some stuff that supports him as like almost a genuine messianic figure. I mean, the figure of the character of Shatov, who is like, I think probably the figure who's closest to Dostoevsky's own perspective, did genuinely believe in him as a messianic figure or as a holy figure, and is devastated by what he sees as his sort of turning away from that. And Shatov, in fact, quotes him as having said something like, "You once told me that if you learned that Christ was not the truth, you choose Christ over truth," which some Dostoevsky himself said and very dearly believed, right? So it's interesting that he would be attributed to this figure. And I think one way you can read him, and I think what makes him such a disturbing figure is just that a sort of like almost like Gnostic idea of like the evil or amoral God, because
Hmm.
Dostoevsky's like cosmos is so grim, and the problem of evil is such an important theme in his work, obviously, and it's never really answered. And
Hmm.
one possible disturbing answer is that evil is like an aspect of God, right? And I think in Stavrogin, you have him sort of exploring that possibility. So many of Dostoevsky's characters are characters who sort of want to be godlike, in some way.
Yeah,
Um,
Kirillov most prominently in
yes, yeah,
Demons. Yeah.
yeah. And Raskolnikov, obviously, Mishkin in a very different way, Alyosha in a very different way. And Stavrogin doesn't really seem to want to do that or much of anything really, but he through that he's maybe a figure of a disturbing sort of concept of God or of the divine.
Yeah, and I think one of the great conservative novels, I suppose, because
I
at
think
its
more like
base,
reactionary. I think it's the
yeah,
great
yeah.
reactionary novel. Yeah,
It's
it
like
really makes like
there's
left-wing people seem fucking terrifying after you read
yeah.
Demons.
And there's just
It's
the
like,
general
yeah.
just fear of all this stuff happening, of anything happening almost at the foot of like, I guess, perfect imperial Russia. Just the notion of anyone trying to change anything being the beginning of the apocalypse, being like this is what's gonna pull the rug. And I guess the kind of polemicist Dostoevsky and the novelist Dostoevsky are not quite the same guy. But here, and it's effective. It's very effective. But you do feel like the Russian Revolution is not that far away, and the kind of smaller little pre-revolutions leading to it, and that there's something in the air that's already being sniffed by our man, and it's making him shudder in his overcoat, and you can really feel that through this. And of course, he makes it metaphysical and he makes it religious, but the ferment of the time comes through. But it's from like the opposite point. It's like from the Winter Palace looking out, thinking, "Oh goodness."
It's interesting the point about the novelist and the polemicist being different because I feel like, I mean, the figure of Stepan Trimovich, who's like not really a radical but sort of liberal, like represents the sort of westernizing current.
A
That
great character. One of his
yeah,
like, yeah,
I
great,
mean, like
rounded, kind of pathetic, but like ultimately weirdly admirable.
I think
And then going like a holy fool at the end, walking
yeah,
into the peasant
I
land.
think
Yeah.
the ending is like incredibly moving of his character. Like it's and he is a sort of ridiculous figure for a lot of it, but still he has this sort of dignity to him, which is very moving by the end.
Yeah, and like the classic figure of the older generation trying to be down with the kids, not realizing that the kids are going to eat him.
Yeah,
Yeah, and,
the figure of the novelist who's like a parody of Turgenev, right? It's
yeah, yeah. I love that. My favorite character, and it's Pyotr Andreevich or whatever he's called, the mover, the one who's
yes,
just like who's doing things, who's just organizing the vague revolution that may or may not involve anyone else in any other towns, but he
yes, yeah.
yeah, yeah, just an extraordinary character, extraordinary kind of demonic force of energy. Just all the scenes with Pyotr are so strange. The scene where Pyotr tries to convince Kirillov to kill himself, I think, is one of the best scenes Dostoevsky ever wrote.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Let's move on to 1880s, the 80s as we call them.
Yeah, so this is the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas by Machado de Assis.
Now, this is
Uh,
right over my head. Is it over your head, up Milo? You ever heard
Yeah,
of this
it's
book?
soaring over.
a Brazilian novelist who is not very well known outside Brazil, I don't think, but considered like the great Brazilian novelist, I think. Yeah, very interesting backstory. I mean, he was the grandson, I think, of slaves. He was writing, I think, at a time, at least when he started, when slavery was still legal in Brazil. I think started out as a poet, wasn't very successful at that, so became a novelist. And this is, as the title suggests, a novel narrated by its protagonist from their grave. As he puts it, like not an author who died, but a dead man who became an author. Like he became an author after his death. Yeah, he reflects on sort of the uselessness of his life and of like life in general, basically, in sort of this very sort of digressive, non-linear way. It's like Tristram Shandy via Schopenhauer, basically. Yeah, makes it sound very, very grim, which it sort of is, or very pessimistic at least. But it's also very funny. I mean, it's very sort of, I mean, I think it's quite unlikely that like Beckett would have read it, but it feels very like of a piece with him, like that sort of gallows humor, the sort of, yeah, very, very pessimistic account of human life rendered with sympathy and a lot of humor. And even the pessimism is sort of tempered by the fact it's all filtered through Brás Cubas's perspective. And Brás Cubas is like the worst. He's completely useless and horrible, basically. And so you could read it as just him sort of projecting all his own failings onto like existence, life itself, which again has the political dimension because he's sort of representative of like the Brazilian elites that DSC saw as very like stagnant and uncreative. And yeah,
Let's 1890s. We're getting out. We're close to the end of the century.
yeah. So this is so not that well known, I don't think. It's the Christ and Antichrist trilogy by Dmitry Merezhkovsky, which is three novels that are not really narratively contiguous. So they have like there are narrative links between them, but sort of thematically of a piece. all basically about like the relationship of Christianity to paganism and sort of through that of like the flesh to the spirit or body to soul or whatever. Um, the first of them focuses on Julian the Apostate, the second on Leonardo da Vinci, and the third on Peter the Great and his son Alexei. So yeah, a wide scope. I don't really have a very strong sense of this, but I don't think it's that widely read even in Russia at this point. I mean, I think even at the time, it was sort of better received outside Russia than within. Partly, I think, because Merezhkovsky was quite a difficult person and made a lot of enemies. Alexander Bloch, I think, described him as like a writer who all of us admire and none of us love. And so, yeah, when it was released in I think it was translated into French first, and then it was translated to English fairly early. I'm not sure what the language is. Um, yeah, apparently a French reviewer described it as like, the great Russian novel establishes Merezhkovsky as like the heir to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, which caused such a stir in Russia that Merezhkovsky had to issue a statement saying like, I don't consider myself the heir to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Um,
Russian literary culture, man. What's going on there?
yeah, actually, I mean, I don't know about on the level of like literary quality, but on the level of like theme, that's absolutely not true. That's exactly what he considered himself. He, yeah, wrote this essay comparing the two where I don't know if he invented it. So it's like quite a common thing I've read in a few places, but that like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are like the Old and New Testament of Russian literature. Tolstoy, the great writer of like the flesh and the body and the earth, and Dostoevsky is like the spirit and the mind.
Heard the sun and the moon, yin and
Yeah.
yang. Yeah.
And Merezhkovsky's whole like both literary and like quasi-religious purpose was this like third testament that would unite the two. The
Quran. He's writing the Quran.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We figured it out. That whole video with Gabriel Said Reynolds. We know who wrote it. To the presses.
Yeah, so he tries to sort of
great.
yeah, so across the three novels tries to sort of map this relationship, and I think it remains more or less consistent. They've developed somewhat. I mean, the first one about Julian the Apostate, I think he's like more sympathetic to paganism than Christianity, although not completely so. By the third, it's sort of more about, it's not so much contrasting paganism and Christianity as like trying to make something new out of both of them and sort of contrasting that to the abuse or manipulation of both of them by political power as represented by Peter the Great, who's portrayed like very negatively. They're very much like novels of ideas. They're not very like, I mean, he's often considered quite a cold writer, which I guess he is, but if that sounds appealing, I would recommend.
Yeah, and would you have a favorite of the three? Julian, Da Vinci, or Peter?
I think the second one is probably like the richest. It does have a quality a bit like George Eliot's like Romola, where like every famous person from Renaissance Florence shows up at some point. It's like, oh, Da Vinci meeting Michelangelo, Raphael, Savonarola, Machiavelli, etc., and they all sort of represent different strains of thought and so on. But yeah, I think that's probably the richest just as a novel. I think there's a wonderful moment I think in the third volume where some sort of monks of a certain like old believer type strand who fear religious persecution by Peter start singing this like hymn about martyrdom, and that sort of fuses with like the bird song, and that's the sort of fusion of heaven and earth, like spirit and flesh and so on. It's very moving once you've read everything coming up to that point. So again, it's one of those things where the cumulative effect is probably more powerful than anything individually in the novels.
20th century, eh? The 1900, the second noughties.
Yeah, so it's another Russian, Hadji Murat, Tolstoy. It's a sort of novella, I guess, about this Caucasian sort of rebel leader, titular Hadji Murat, whose family are sort of held hostage by a rival rebel leader, so makes an alliance with the Russians to try to rescue them. And yeah, it's late Tolstoy, but it's much less sort of didactic than a lot of late Tolstoy. You don't really get a sense of the sort of religious obsessions that he was writing about at that time. It's much more similar in some ways to like the earlier sort of more narratively straightforward Tolstoy. And yeah, I mean, Tolstoy is quite a hard writer to talk about just because it's just like all perfect, basically, particularly in the shorter works. But yes, obviously this is like, it's much more focused than something like War and Peace, but still sort of quite, like there's still a few digressions. Like it's like, there's this Russian prince Vorontsov, who gets depicted quite a lot. There's like stuff that we just see the Tsar like up close. Sort of moves away from Hadji specifically. But yeah, certainly working in a much more like focused mode than in the longer novels.
Yeah, what's it about? About what is this? Is it like is this Caucasian rebel leader our main character? Like
Yes,
what's
yeah,
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 yeah, yeah.
definitely. Yeah, and so his attempts to sort of rescue his family from this rival. Um, and yeah, I mean, again, it's interesting to compare to War and Peace because, you know, one of the themes of that, right, is that individuals don't really influence history much. It's sort of these extra personal sort of forces that drive it. And in a sense, that's true here. I mean, there's a certain like fatalism to everything that's depicted. Like Haji Murad is kind of a character like trapped between these forces that he can't control and can't influence really. But there's a certain like heroism in his attempts to try to do that, right? And it's sort of sense that like even if it doesn't matter on the sort of grand scale, it very much does on the sort of intimate individual scale. Yeah, I mean, I think quite a lot of people I think have compared like Tolstoy to Homer, right? And I think particularly here, there's a sense of like the sort of simultaneous sense of like fate or destiny in some sense, but also like a lot of pathos to how individuals try to manage that and navigate that.
It's interesting that he has this individuals don't change history, you know, ideology or position, given how much he, as an individual, changed Russian history.
Yeah.
Out to the 1910s, World Wars, things getting juicy.
Yeah, so this is definitely contradicts what I said earlier about not choosing very obvious stuff because this is In Search of Lost Time, Proust. It's sort of I had to choose it A because like I think it is on balance the best novel I've ever read. B because so much of the other like particularly the 19th century stuff is sort of like overshadowed by it. So I sort of read that through this, particularly the Nerval, but also like Stendhal to an extent, Balzac to an extent. And yeah, again, hard to talk about just because everyone's already talked about it. But I think it's generally quite interesting thinking about a novel like this famous and that everyone sort of has some concept of before they read it, as to like what surprises you the most when you do read it.
Yeah,
Um,
Calvino said like the definition of a classic is a novel that you know off by heart but still surprises you when you
yeah,
read it.
yeah. And I think with Proust for me, it was like the how much of it becomes about like again this very sort of merciless like dissection of like human cruelty, jealousy, possessiveness, which is there alongside the the sort of rapturous like ecstatic stuff about memory art, etc. But it's also becomes, and particularly in the sort of midsection with the whole Albertine plot, it becomes like incredibly about jealousy basically and about how the attempt to sort of possess and control another person. And similar to that, sort of the dissection of like French high class society and how sort of merciless that is, and how the sort of snobbishness and the cruelty that sort of not just is present, but sort of is everything there. Even the boring sections, of which there are some, like the sort of endless dinner party scenes, they both are very effective at conveying that and sort of make the sublime moments even better when you get to them, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of the middle march for anxious men who think their girlfriends are lesbians. Like there is
Yes.
no
Yeah.
greater work of that particular subgenre. So pages and pages of, but what if she's with that other woman in an amorous sense? And this is like a 4-page sentence, just like, but it could be consider she left the house at this time, and I've stayed at home here, and then typically she meets her on this road, and she will have passed this road, but I must be crazy. There's no way she went down that road unless she took a shortcut in order to get to the hall, in which case she definitely met her there. And because the time is midday, that and it's just you go
No, keep
crazy.
going, keep going.
You lose it with him, but it is very effective. It's also the great book of trying to sleep in a bed you haven't slept in before and being unable to do so. It happens many times throughout, just sort of lying there staring at the ceiling, page after page of that. All of which sounds like the least interesting book ever written, but I think it is. It's the ability because these feelings, when you experience them in life, are very vivid, and it's not like when you can't get to sleep. It's not a neutral feeling. It's a really upsetting feeling, but it's hard to describe it in a book without it just being. And he really, really tried to go to sleep, but it wouldn't happen. What a shame. But Proust is like burrowing into that particular mania that seems to develop. You know, it's just it's
Yeah.
a new room. I can't get to sleep. I can't do any of these things. And the whole of the memory structure, instead of being, I suppose you remember the big events, the big things, and you plug them together. But it's almost trying to burrow in, why did I feel that particular way at that particular time about something that now feels so trivial? Not being able to get to sleep becomes the most trivial thing ever, like 2 days later, because, you know, it's like, what did you eat
Yeah.
last
Yeah.
Tuesday? I don't know. But Proust is sort of like, yeah, what did I eat last Tuesday?
And
And why, yeah, and following that strain of memorial connections.
yeah, which is also sort of, I mean, the how the love or the obsession with Albertine, like, there are moments when he sort of thinks back on that. It's like, why did I care so much? What meaning did that have? It did, obviously, at the time, and it was like completely consuming his mind in a way that's like, I mean, the way that's described, sort of the logic of that is quite similar to the more like ecstatic, like rapturous passages where it's like this sort of just completely unhinged movement from one thing to like one sort of starting point just leads to another to another to another, and so you have this like spiral built, which when you're talking about like the sort of involuntary memory or like the moments of like wonder is like this spiral upwards, and then with the jealousy or with the failure to get to sleep, the sort of like the boredom that comes through so much of it, it's a sort of spiral inwards or downwards, but it's all sort of the same sort of winding sort of style.
Yeah, I like using a spiral to describe it because you can also sort of use a network or like a plexus or something. All of the you're trying to see this web of
Yeah,
events, and they kind of slowly fill out and conjoin. I mean, you know, volume after volume. And which translation did you read of interest?
uh,
I'm surprised there's only like two in
yeah,
English,
I
two
read the
full
Scott
ones.
Monkeyf. Yeah, there's
Yeah, it
um
feels reasonable. One translator. I know he didn't finish the last volume because of unfortunate death, but the newer Penguin one, which I'm interested in, but each volume being a different translator, must like there's something so mono about Proust. It's just this one style, the greatest sentences you've ever read, but it's so detectable. And I wonder what happens when you give each volume to a different person, because of course they have to render it in their own way.
it's also, I think, sort of like sort of recreating in miniature what someone like Balzac could do over the course of like a novel cycle, in the sense of like, because of the duration and because of the scope in terms of time, you have characters you haven't seen for like 3 volumes show up. It's like, oh, that's that guy. Okay, it sort of has
Yeah, and it's nice to have a memory novel where you also partake
yeah,
in remembering, like, oh yeah, that this page in the book is the Madeline effect to a previous page in the same book. This particular sentence brings me back to Swan's Way or whatever. But it's yeah, it's like the same because it is. I mean, I guess there's many ways you can read it. A friend of mine read the whole thing on his 30-minute commute to and from university over the course of, I think, a year. So it was just a constant thing with him. I went for like the 2 month, let's do this, big sessions. But it's regardless of how you shape it, you're going to be there for a long time. And it's interesting how if that's part of the work, right? It's not just that it's a really long book, but that its longness is essential to its character. And quite a few of your choices have been, you know, novellas and these really short, pithy, direct. The idea is encapsulated in these fingers, whereas Proust is so the opposite of that. Because you could shorten it. It's not like it has that there's this much
yeah,
happens. So much is just him in his room rocking back and forward. But if she went to the high street at 2 p.m. and then her friend lives at the second floor and typically looks out her window and will have seen her and they will have shared a glance, even though she came back, this kind of thing. You don't need to do that, but it's interesting, especially the time he's writing it, which is, I think, before we get so much of the consciously endless, consciously let's keep pushing and pushing and pushing as an artistic effect. It seems more naturalistic in Proust's approach. But yeah, no, I just think it's fascinating to use the length, not merely as kind of like in the Dickens way of there'll be more incident, more events, more details, but just to spin you out, to constantly spin you around these things.
Morton Feldman. John Ashbery described Proust as a guy who found a form that allowed him to write anything he wanted. I'm being jealous of that. Just that you found a specific way of just you can put anything in there. You just dip the bucket in the water, and put the bucket there full of water, and that's the thing, and you don't have to do more than that. Let's move on to the 20s, high modernism.
Yeah, so I mean, a very stacked decade, maybe this the strongest, I don't know. And this one I think is a little bit more obscure. Rakes of the Old Courts, Matthew Caggiali, I might well be pronouncing that wrong. Yeah, Romanian novel from I think 29. Also could easily be called In Search of Lost Time, but in more of like a social context or shared context than in Proust. And not much of a plot here. It's like these group of like young sort of libertine types sort of move through Bucharest, sort of having these very digressive conversations and drinking a lot, basically. It was, I think, Caggiali's only novel. He was better known as a poet, and he apparently spent like 20 years writing it or so, despite it being very short. It's like 150 pages. And when you read it, even in translation, it's pretty obvious why. I mean, I read the Sean Coder translation, and it has maybe the most like densely obscure vocabulary of any novel I've ever read. I mean, ranging from words that are like unusual but not that strange, like salubrious, appanage, autochthonous, words that I've literally never seen in any other context, cissate, detapation, all these extremely obscure Latinate words, which apparently, according to Cotter, that recreates the effect in Romanian, that specifically it uses a lot of like Romanian words from Turkish, of which there aren't many, but there are some. Um, and to sort of give it a certain like, a lot of the novels sort of about Romania as this like bridge between East and West. I mean, the characters are sort of very much like modeling themselves on like the French sort of decadent types, but in this very sort of Eastern European Balkan context. It's an interesting thing with like the challenge of translation, because obviously, I mean, I would assume that the effect of using Turkish origin words in Romanian is to make it seem like less Latinate, less European. The effect of using all these Latinate words in English is the opposite. So I don't think
Yeah.
quite you can quite capture that. Um, but yeah, it's mostly a novel about atmosphere and ideas and sort of very interesting glimpse into this world that I don't really know much about. I'm not super familiar with the details, but as I understand it, like obviously Romanian is a Romance language, but because of its geography, has quite a lot of Slavic, Turkish, I think some Hungarian influence. But in the 19th century, during the sort of language reform, nationalization, sort of nationalism sort of period, there was an attempt to sort of make it more Latinate, to make it more Western European. And so by using this sort of very Turkish influenced vocabulary, it's sort of something outmoded, something out of time. Is interesting again to contrast with like the French sort of decadent symbolist literature of this period, which is so obsessed with like Orientalism, like Easternness, sort of this exoticism. That's sort of, yeah, Romania has a very odd position in that sense.
What do you like about it? What's good
Yeah,
about reading like Salubri
I
Calabrijoculus
mean, I think
Boncula?
it is mostly like an atmosphere thing. Like it's a novel of atmosphere, this very sort of intensely nostalgic sort of evocation of this city. I mean, I've never been to Bucharest, but you feel it very strongly in this novel. And it's also, I don't think it specifies when it's set, but it's clearly like before World War One. So it's written, you know, 20s obviously afterwards. So again, sort of somewhat similar to like The Lighthouse or something. There's this sense of like the passing of time and the effect that has on individuals. And yeah, it's just a lot of like just very beautifully like atmospheric and dense in that sense.
Yeah, let's go to the 30s.
Yeah, this is A Glassbury Romance, John Cooper Powys. You were saying you would love to read like a Dickens novel about a Celtic river god. Well, it's not quite what this is, but it's quite Dickensian in its structure. It's this group of like, well, broad group of characters in Glastonbury in the sort of beginning of the 20th century, sort of mystic John Gurd, who's trying to sort of revive Glastonbury as like a place of pilgrimage and spirituality. This his sort of friend and sort of collaborator Owen Evans, who's a sort of mystic, who's probably the Powys self-portrait to an extent, set against this sort of industrialist who's trying to, make money off of the place, and this sort of supporting cast of like various locals, like political radicals, revolutionaries, anarchists, etc. And yeah, but all of that sort of immediate sort of narrative character level is sort of always undergirded or overshadowed or whatever by this sort of mythic sense of the main metaphor being like the Grail legend and the Holy Grail, and Glastonbury as a sort of, I mean, I think Powys himself said the protagonist of the novel is the Grail, which is obviously like quite a common like image in literature of this period and art of this period, like Eliot, obviously, like Wagner. But I feel Powys, it's sort of a bit like what, Coppola was trying to do with his Dracula. It's just like, this is everything you could possibly do with the Grail legend. So it's like a completely exhaustive treatment. And after this, no one needs to bother. Um, so yeah, it's very, very sprawling. It's like 1,300 pages or so. And it's definitely not perfect. There are some boring bits, but the heights are just like so good.
DBH recommended John Cooper Powys to us in our interview with him.
That doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the ending, which I won't spoil, but well, not so much the ending of the plot, but the last like page or so. The best way I can describe it is like the last page of Middlemarch rewritten by Yeats.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, any hot takes on why John Cooper Powys isn't a household name?
I mean, it's 1,300 pages long, which probably doesn't help.
Well, Proust didn't stop him.
That's true. Yeah. It's also, I don't know if this was a factor, but I think it's actually quite difficult to get a complete copy because there was like some lawsuits not long after it came out where it's like a scene where a character like has sex in a cave and the character isn't real, but the cave is, and the character is like the owner of the land that the cave's on, and that guy thought it was like libelous, so sued Powys, and so got that chapter or scene or whatever removed. Maybe that's a role. I don't know.
British lawyers denied us the greatest the greatest British novel of the 20th century.
Yeah, I like it being on behalf of the cave. It's libelous to the cave. The cave is not host to such orgies. This must be removed from the text. You have besmirched our humble, real cave. No one must read this book that would otherwise be a classic next to Dickens on your shelf. Alas. Anyway, on that, let's move on to the 40s. Everyone's favorite decade.
Yeah. So this is The Death of Virgil, Hermann Brock. One of those where the plot is basically the title. Virgil dies, and you have his dying monologue over the course of the novel, but specifically sort of his thoughts of despair, basically, about his whole life and project and how it was all useless and maybe actively harmful. And yeah. And yeah, just sort of this monologue conveyed at great length. But I mean, I haven't read it in German. I would like to try, but I don't know how difficult it is. But even in English, it's like maybe the most successful novel I've read at like writing an entire like quite long novel sort of in the style of like lyric poetry for the entire duration. It's just like I mean, this sort of Brock somewhat does that in the Sleepwalkers, but that's much more like varied. Whereas for this, it's just like a single sort of like single monologue, single sort of rhapsodic sort of tone throughout.
Proto Bernhardian, great, keeping this single voice, single location, single theme, and just the sheer musicality of the sentences keeps the book alive, and it's kind of miraculous that it does it. It feels like surely this would teeter over the edge, would become tedious after 30 pages, after 40 pages, after 50 pages. But I don't quite know how it's done. If I knew how it was done, I'd have written like 900 of these novels. But I guess extremely hard work. Brock was extremely fastidious. And
it's interesting that it's all about sort of a complete like crisis of faith in literature itself and in like expression itself, that you're then able to create this like masterpiece out of it.
Yeah, it's like all those Shakespeare sonnets that, oh gosh, I'm so bad at writing poetry, just expressed in the finest lines of the English language.
Yeah. What do you make of Brock's take on Virgil?
You mean that it was all useless, or?
Well, sort of that. Just his artistic read through Virgil's lips on the Aeneid. Should we have destroyed the Aeneid? My question to you.
Yeah, I mean,
okay,
yes.
That's a yes.
Yeah, obviously. Wouldn't have to read Death of Virgil in that case, and I would have saved some time. Yeah.
Time for business. Time for.
I mean, obviously, the whole like what was going on in Europe at the time is very relevant to this, right? The sort of the sense of how art and literature is like shaped by political context, the sort of like how it can be served as propaganda.
I'm not quite sure
Um,
what you're referring to. I'll just open
The social
Wikipedia.
social
What?
housing boom, I think, is what he's talking about. They built a
Hold
lot of
the
social
fort.
housing.
What's going on here? This Wikipedia page is insane.
yeah, I believe Brock was Austrian Jewish, right, and was writing it in exile, I think. Yeah, I would say actually the tone of it does remind me quite a lot of the Aeneid in a strange way, like that sort of like dreamy sort of melancholy to it, and the sort of like sense of like drifting through this sort of world. Obviously, as structured a narrative, it's very very different, but yeah, it does sort of capture some of that, I think.
My introduction to Brock was I think the Antonioni film, the
Oh yeah, yeah,
La Notte, where
yeah.
Monica Vitti's reading it at the party. And I thought, she's good looking. Must be a good book.
Correct. Again.
Again, this is 100% hit rate. I don't think it's Sleepwalkers. I don't think it's Death of
I
Virgil.
think so. Yeah.
Yeah. On to the 50s.
Yeah. Again, didn't intend this, but another monologue of a dying Roman.
It happens.
It's a good time for them. It's a
Yeah.
yeah.
Memoirs of Hadrian, Marguerite's Yourcenar. Again, sort of in the title, Memoirs of Hadrian, the Emperor. So reflecting on his life and his career and his rise to be emperor. Sort of quite heavily, but not exclusively focusing on his relationship to Antoninus, this sort of young lover who he then made a god. But also on his life generally, on Roman society generally. I mean, again, a lot of overlap with Brock, obviously. I would say by comparison, it's a bit more of like a conventional novel. It's like more about how Hadrian sort of exists in the world and interacts with the characters, even if it's all sort of felt through his perspective. Also, like Rex of the Old Court took a ridiculous amount of time to write, like 25 years, I think. She like attempted it several times and abandoned it, like destroyed the drafts. I think not so much because the style is particularly intense, but just because it took like a ridiculous amount of research. She like read everything she possibly could in order to like most fully and vividly like recreate this world. And I think it really succeeds. I mean, it's like you're sort of aware as you're reading that Yourcenar as a writer is a 20th century writer, but you never feel that, Hadrian is a 20th century character. Like it feels so in his consciousness.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great time for writing about Romans. I mean, Graves as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, there really is something's in the air.
Yeah, I
Um,
think Yourcenar said it was like she wanted to write about like the transition period from paganism to Christianity, which he saw as quite similar to her own period.
yeah, and I got the first and the Antichrist trilogy as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
Julian the
definitely.
Apostate. Is this the third? This is the third Roman novel on your list.
I
Third
guess so,
Roman,
yeah.
ancient
Yeah.
Rome. Yeah, what a time to be alive. Yeah, do we get from what period is it again? Like late Hadrian, like
Yes, yeah, yeah.
looking
It's
back on the
as
life.
he is
Yeah.
I can't remember if he's specifically dying, but it's
Sure.
his last years, yes.
Hmm. Cool. 60s. Let's get groovy. 1960s.
Yeah, this is Riders in the Chariots, Patrick White, Australian novelist. Somewhat similar to Powys. You have a sort of like the lives of these characters as they intersect and interact, but also with this sort of mythic sense sort of overshadowing everything, overhanging everything.
Hmm.
In this case, it's the chariots, like macabre mysticism, like Jewish mysticism, sort of stuff from Ezekiel and so on, is the central sort of metaphor image. But the narrative as it is, like it basically follows these four characters. Mary Hare, who's this sort of almost like holy fool figure, this sort of like eccentric, sort of isolated, like heiress of a formerly sort of rich, powerful Australian family. Mordecai Himmelfarb, who is this Holocaust survivor, German Jewish Holocaust survivor and refugee. Ruth Godbold, who's this sort of very religious sort of servant woman, like cleaner. And Alf Dubbo, who's a sort of Aboriginal or part Aboriginal artist with a very troubled life and very traumatic sort of backstory. And it's sort of the characters are sort of quite separate for quite a lot of it, but it sort of tracks how they converge and combine. White obviously is drawing a lot on like high modernism, like I think Lawrence probably most of all, but also Joyce, Mann, etc. And it's sort of writing in that tradition in a sense, but also with a sort of very different historical context. I mean, obviously, the fact that the Holocaust plays a role would not have been possible for those writers. The history of like mistreatment of Aboriginals, the sort of stolen generations also plays a role. So it's set in very much an Australian context as well. And yeah, that sort of combination, I guess, of like, again, they're very specific, like both emotional intimacy and sort of the Australian landscape with this sort of like quite global, sort of wider perspective. The fact that one of the main characters is a Holocaust survivor, a refugee, etc. Yeah, that's what I like about it, basically.
The mythic elements of it, is it all just it's all the Hebrew Bible stuff? We don't, there's no like weird Australian.
Not that I can remember. You do get a lot of the Australian landscape, particularly in the artist, obviously. But I think most of the religious elements are Jewish or Christian. I mean, there's quite a lot of Christian symbolism as well. But yeah, it's mostly the chariot, the chariot imagery.
Australian lit is a massive, massive blind spot for me. I don't think I've finished a single Australian novel in my life.
You started them all, but
I started it, yeah, I got one word from the end of every single Australian novel, but then thought, nah.
Lost interest.
Even films, like Picnic at Hanging Rock, Mad Max, that's about it.
Mm.
Should we head into where are we? 1970s.
Sure,
Yeah.
yes. So this is The Obscene Bird of Nights, Jose Donoso from Chile. This might be the hardest to describe just on the level of plot. Yeah, one of the English translators says something like, the only thing you can say for sure after finishing The Obscene Bird of Night is that you finished The Obscene Bird of Night. It's kind of baffling in a lot of places. It sort of mostly takes place in this sort of like decaying, like hollowed out sort of aristocratic home family in Chile. It's narrated, I guess, by this figure Umberto, who's like the secretary to the family. But even that's sort of misleading because the boundaries between the characters often aren't very clear. I mean, Umberto sort of transforms himself or is transformed in some way into this figure of like Mundito, the mute who has like no mouth. He's also often sort of conflated or blended with Geronimo, who's like the patriarch of the family. Geronimo's wife, Inez, is often conflated with Peta, this sort of servant woman and possible witch. There's also this figure of Iris, who is like a sort of Mary figure. There's mention of like a virgin birth. She's sort of outside the family, outside the home, sort of more in the town. And so, yeah, it's quite a confusing novel. It's again, like the Brock, it's the Proust, it's, gorgeously written, these like very long extended sentences, metaphors, etc. Obviously, as you can probably tell from the premise, it's very influenced by Gothic fiction, European Gothic, but put in quite a specifically Latin American context. Like there's a lot of mentions of like the Imbunche myth, which I don't really know much about, but as I understand it is like these figures in Chilean folklore who are like children either sold to or kept or like kidnapped by witches and wizards and then transformed into these sort of like stunted figures to guard the caves of the witches. Yeah, and it's just this very extremely atmospheric, extremely sort of disturbing novel that's also like very beautiful.
Is it of the strain of the magical realism you see in a lot of Latin American fiction, or do we just ditch the realism at this point? Just
It's
magical.
yeah, because it was written in, I'd say, the early 70s, so clearly like the Latin American boom had already been a thing and was sort of famous at that point. And I think there's some like almost there are some like jokes about it, I think. Like at one point a character talking about the virgin birth is like, well, it's just a regular virgin birth, it's not a miracle. Um, and I'd say, yeah, so there certainly are similarities. I would say it's probably more in the tradition of like the Latin American, like Gothic or Baroque style, like which is probably a bit less well known outside Latin America, like Jose de Samanima's Paradiso, Alejo Carpentier's Explosion of the Cathedral, some of like Ernesto Sabato. It feels very similar to that. This sort of sense of these sort of very isolated, like cut off worlds with their sort of own rules. Yeah, and that's the tradition it sort of belongs to.
Yeah, cool. I am. That's definitely on the list. That sounds bananas. Yeah.
It's also
Uh,
I have no idea if this was an influence, but it's kind of an interesting thing to consider. In Dante, Mount Purgatorio is like the antipode of Jerusalem, which would put it in the South Pacific, so quite near Chile. I have no idea if that was an influence, but it definitely has a very like purgatorial atmosphere to it.
yeah, cool. A bit of supernaturalism and the sort of the occult and the magical seem to be saturating this list quite a bit as
Definitely,
well.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. What's your like? Do you think realism was just had a in general a bit of a restrictive, poisonous effect on fiction, or do you think it's quite good to have it there so that the it being punctured feels more
Yeah, I guess I'd say
interesting?
probably more the latter. I mean, I do love a lot of very realist stuff. I mean, like Stendhal is pretty realist, right? But Dickens
Proust,
for the most
even,
part,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I guess I would say I like sort of intermingling or penetration of the two. Yeah,
I suppose there's like, the supernatural is only, it only works when it interacts with the natural. If there are
yeah,
just
yeah,
two realms with like a completely thick concrete wall between them, they might as well not exist to each other. Um,
Yeah, or two realms, but both of them have weird demons going around at about an equivalent rate. It's like, well, okay, I'm not too interested in the other world, or indeed the absence of demons. It
mhm.
is, yeah, it works completely on the contrast. And maybe even on a generic level, you need infinite realist novels you will never read to exist to understand that the supernatural novel is doing something. If it was
Yeah,
just supernatural novels, then that would just be the form. The form of the novel is to
yeah,
get
yeah,
a bit
exactly.
freaky.
And I suppose that's what the novel did is it introduced realism into fiction, which sort of like before the 18th century in Europe at any rate. You got like the Tale of Genji and stuff over in the East, but if you're telling a story, it's got to have something really weird in it in order for
yeah.
it to justify itself being a story. Whereas people suddenly writing about day to day life, that's the real interesting left field intrusion into human
Yeah,
storytelling.
no, yeah, that's true. Yeah, because it's always a story. You tell a story because it's interesting and weird and not what is happening. And you go back to those really early, you look at Homer and all these guys, it's always astounding. And maybe we're touched by some of the smaller moments, but I think that's somewhat of an us fixation. But then to actually form, especially something like Proust, which takes on the attitude of an epic, biggest book ever written. What's it about? Some guy remembering things
Yeah.
he did. What did he do? Not much.
Ulysses as well, just explicitly being Homeric.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
exactly. Flipping the script.
Cyclops, it's just a guy in a bar. Yeah. Uh,
Mm.
Over to the 80s.
Yeah, so this is Repetition or Wiederholung by Peter Handke. Broadly autobiographical, I guess. It follows this mixed sort of Austrian Slovene protagonist, as Handke himself is, as he attempts to sort of trace his older brother, who disappeared in the Slovene sort of resistance, and sort of his attempts to sort of trace the landscape he associates with that. Yeah, it's a very interesting novel, I think, to consider in the context of like Handke's career and his body work as a whole, because his early novels are very much like about these very sort of isolated, sort of alienated protagonists, and they're all written in this very sort of detached style. Like you mentioned, Alan Aubrier as a big influence. I think starting with sort of the early 80s, so like Slow Homecoming, but really accumulating in this, he sort of moves into a more like much more sort of ecstatic, like rapturous style at times, and much more sort of involved and invested in the world, which is also sort of the trajectory that the protagonist in this goes on, right? He sort of goes from this, yeah, very cut off status to this much more embodied, sort of involved. That trajectory, because it's also very much associated in this with the idea of Yugoslavia as a contrast to Austria, the Slavic as a contrast to the Germanic. That would lead Handke into some very bad directions in the 90s politically, and some, I mean, not as bad, but I don't like his late 90s novels as much. They sort of attempt a sort of epic thing, which I don't think fully comes off, but I think this is like the perfect like balance of the two. I think it's, yeah, his best novel.
And we're at the end of the century now, the
Uh,
big 1990.
Yeah, could we be
yes,
saving the best till last? Or the worst till last? Or sort of one of the middling ones till last? Up to you, Adam.
I think it's sort of in the middle. I'd not rank them, but
March.
yeah.
Forgive me. It's Middlemarch, 1990s pick.
Now hear me out. Hear me out.
It's the Penguin edition that was published in the 1990s. The font just gives it something.
Yeah, this is Vladimir Sharov, The Rehearsals, about a fictional Russian sort of religious sect, um, who believe that in order to bring about the second coming, they have to sort of act out the events of the New Testament and end up sort of forming a town basically to do this, where like roles are passed down like generation to generation. Like someone always plays like Pilate, someone plays Mary or whatever, but no one plays Christ, interestingly. Again, it takes quite a while in the novel to like reveal that's what
It's
it's
like
about.
80 pages or
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
It starts with like this quite broad discussion of like Orthodox theology. Then it's about like Gogol and like the hidden symbolism in the nose. And then it's sort of and it's quite interesting that this novel is written in like the 90s because I feel it definitely has like the opening of like the archives in the post-Soviet period, I think is very important because
Especially to a historian like Sharov.
yes,
Yeah.
but I think his novels are like they're historical in the sense they're about historical subjects, but they're also very much about like how history is transmitted and received and perceived. I mean, there's lots of like archives, journals, letters, etc. Um, there's a line from one of his essays, something like Russia is a country with an unpredictable past, which I think is very important to him. Um, and yeah, this sort of, I mean, like a lot of his novels, it's sort of about the apocalyptic sort of messianic strand in Russian history, Russian culture, and how that sort of intersects between the political and the secular. So the religious and the secular, religious and the political. Yeah, it's also just very entertaining. Like, well, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, like it moves very fast. It's sort of these different like you got sort of jumping
As
between different
someone
strands.
who wasn't interested in this stuff, I can also say it's interesting if you're not interested in this stuff. I think it's just, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And also quite interesting for considering like again, like Russian politics at the time. I mean, I think of a figure like Dugin, who obviously after the 90s was just like a reactionary traditionalist type, but in the 90s was claimed to be that and also a Bolshevik. I think I was trying to find a source for this and couldn't, but I think like
Very Russian.
yes, yeah. I think I remember reading that when he was part of the National Bolshevik Party in the 90s, Dugin told all members to read this book about like Bolshevism as like an apocalyptic Christian movement. Um,
It's a very Dugin-esque, yeah,
yeah.
kind of.
And also, like, again, this is one of the interesting, again, I didn't intend this, but interesting, like, connections between them. I think if you compare to Dostoevsky, I mean, I think those sort of heretical, schismatic strands of Russian Orthodoxy are like very influential in Dostoevsky's novels in a way that's not really recognized, I don't think. Um, and also very influenced by the fact that I think around that time, in like the 1860s or so, you had the first like real historical studies of those movements. So again, it's a very similar context to what Machado was writing in.
Yeah, and a similar attraction in Dostoevsky and Antichrist trilogy of retelling history from some heterodox perspective.
Yeah,
No, this heterodox weird cult thing will pretend they knew everything that was going on in history and tell history as if as if yeah they had access to the truth. Yeah.
yeah. It's interesting also because, as I understand it, like those sort of movements, they were sort of negatively perceived by basically everyone in the intellectual world of Russia because, like, for the Westernizers, liberals, they were like, you know, superstitious, like backwards, etc. For the Slavophile, like Orthodox monarchists, they were like schismatists. They had abandoned the church, right? So sort of everyone hated them.
Yeah, and I suppose like a guy like Dugin is trying to create something that will successfully offend everybody.
That's true. Yes.
Like
Yeah.
the Nazis squinting at the flag, like it looks pretty good just based on color scheme, but then they see the hammer and sickle in the middle, and then yeah. I just like the thing with rehearsals for me is just this central picture of people acting out the Gospels without Jesus is just
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
rich, and every time you keep coming back to this, yeah, circling around the void, all these people moving around an empty space, hoping it will be filled.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like the messianic hope that never comes, but is always you always sort of orient everything around it, you know.
yeah, Life of Brian Core. Yeah, thank you so much
No,
for
thank you.
making the
It's really
time,
fun.
Adam. It's been
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating list. I think there will not be another list that is point for point this one in the history of time. This is a unique
That's probably
list.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, where's like how do you discover these various like strands of because I feel like not that many English people. I mean, how old are you as well, Adam? Like, are reading Herman Brock and like
I'm 30.
you're 30, yeah, same age as us pretty much then. Yeah. So like how Yeah, how did you pick up on this stuff? Where's it coming from? Your family or what?
No. I mean, somewhat. I mean, I'll say my dad's was a big fan of like Joyce and some definitely reads a lot, but not really much of this stuff. I don't know. I mean, the internet basically is the short answer. Like, gives you endless access to lots and lots of stuff. And yeah, just sort of following threads and like, if a writer mentions being influenced by someone, checking them out and so on. Yeah.
Do you write at all?
Yes. Yeah.
Hmm.
I mostly poetry. I've had a few poems published, although I don't think they're among the better ones I've written, to be honest.
Hmm.
And yeah, I do have sort of two like novella drafts I've done that I have queried publishers, but not got anywhere with.
Yeah. Like, does this list reflect your own work at all?
Uh, I guess so. Obviously, there's no poetry on it, right? So that
Sure.
would be
Yeah.
a completely different list. But
Yeah.
yeah, I certainly like that. I write poetry with like themes and subject matter in common with this. In terms of fiction or prose, yeah, I guess so. I don't know. I always find it quite difficult to talk about like or think about like influences specifically because just like everything, like I just try
Yeah,
to
yeah, like yeah, yeah. It just becomes just a list as well.
yeah.
I think it's very hard, like, to auto influence, where, yeah, to talk about your own influences in a way that's genuinely interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes they sort of just come out of left field. Like I remember Paul Thomas Anderson saying one of his major influences was Kurosawa. And I was like, okay, this isn't too useful to know actually. This isn't opening up your films because there's so little in common. I think you just like Kurosawa and that's a good enough reason to say he's an influence. But I think to try and separate artists you really admire and like, and even want to imitate with the ones that have actually successfully influenced your work, that's a different thing. And I think extremely hard to do it from inside. I think like I remember I was reading something you had written, Jack. Maybe it was one of the earlier novels and I noticed it was pretty similar to the Napoleon of Notting Hill, which you hadn't like cited as an influence, but you did realize you'd read it sort of immediately before you started writing this thing. And it's like, yeah, it's not you're not consciously thinking, we're gonna go Chesterton on this one. It just what it borrows out the fingertips. I don't know. So yeah, artists often have the worst things to say about their own work because they don't know what the hell's going on.
And often the richest or the most interesting ideas, the ones that actually give you enough energy to keep writing, tend to be the least articulatable. Yeah, the most what's the word? Unwilling to be yeah, to brought into the daylight. The deepest ones. You
Hmm.
gotta, like, they're so deep that language doesn't, like, go down that far. The language rod. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking like the Nabokov with Lolita saying that monkey drawing the bars of his own cage is the reason I wrote Lolita. Um, kind of, and he knows what that means, knows that connection, and it clearly gives you enough energy to continue working on it for whatever 10 years. But yeah, it's the point is it's inaccessible.
So Adam, can you access it for us? Is our question.
Access the inaccessible. Yeah, I think given
Yes.
time, give me like a week, sure.